Hi everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at the aim constraint. As I've mentioned before, this is a rotation based constraint system, but it doesn't work the same way as the orient constraint. The orient constraint will basically match an object's rotation to another object. The aim constraint will make the object's point or aim at a different object. Okay, so we need sort of a reasonably specific setup for this. This is usually the system more often than not that's used for characters' eyes. Usually we'll set them up with a rig to make the eyes point at some invisible locator objects that don't show up in your render. And then when you move those around, that's what makes the character's eyes move and look around. Okay, so to kind of simulate something along those lines, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a couple of cylinders. I'm using cylinders because it's going to make them a little bit more, it's going to make it more obvious that they're actually rotating rather than them just spinning on the spot, which is what you get with spheres. So what I'm doing here is I'm just sort of positioning these in a way that they're going to be sort of set up on the grid, equally spaced from one another, like that. Now what I can also do is I can rotate them forward like that, and I'm going to lift them up a bit. So we can imagine that these are sort of two eye stalks that we're looking at here. What I might do, just so we've got some kind of reference sort of along those lines, is I'm just going to make like a block. So let's pretend that this is essentially a head of some kind. Okay, and we've got these two eye stalks. I'll just switch on my ambient occlusion, and I'll switch on my wireframe on shaded, and that way we can sort of see the lines. There we go. Okay, so we've got something like that, right? Now, basically for the aim constraint to work, what we need is an object or objects for these things to actually aim at. So what I'm going to do is use a couple of locators. If I pop over to my rigging tab just here, the first icon we've got is locator. So if I click on that, it's going to create this little cross shape here in the middle of the grid. You've got to keep an eye on them because they're sort of just made out of lines. They can be quite, they can kind of vanish very easily if they're sort of down near the grid, with the exception of the vertical lines on them, just there and there. They do sort of become a little bit invisible, so just keep an eye out for them. What I'm going to do here is just line this up with one of these, the middle of one of these tubes, right? Now I can do that by using this little magnet snapping option at the top here. If I click on that, I get a little circle in the middle of the move handle. If I drag that, it'll stick to the middle of the cylinder, and that's because there's a point, a vertex in the middle of that object just there, right? So then what I'm going to do is move this forward away from the shape. Now I can see that the value of that is -2 on the x-axis, right? So I'm going to duplicate that, and then I'm going to get the duplicate, and I'm just going to type +2, and that's going to create another one in front of the other eye. So I've got two little target objects here, and then I've got my two eyes. Now notice that the eyes rotational position, the pivot point, is sort of just inside the box here. They're not in the middle, right? If you were making eyeballs, then they'd be in the middle. With this, I want the back end of the eye stalk to kind of stay where this is, and essentially then I can you know, have these sort of rotate in position. Now if I wanted to, what I could do basically is go in and change this round cap option to on, just there, and then increase the caps, and that way I get this sort of rounded end. What that's going to do is round that on the inside as well, just there, so that if this rotates to a position where it's way over to the side, you can see I get this rounded kind of connection. If I don't do that, it's going to do something like this, where it just snaps off. So that's something that a modeler would need to take consideration into. You know, when we're building the models, we have to think about, okay, how's this going to move? How is this going to bend or deform? Is it going to leave gaps? Do I need to make sure those gaps don't appear? Things like that. That's what we've got to kind of take into consideration when we're modeling. Now, so I've got the same on both sides. I'm going to hit duplicate, and I'm just going to pop this across to +2. And it's now basically lined up where the other one was. Now, I don't necessarily like the rounded ends on here, right? So what I'm going to do, this is slightly turning into a little bit more of a modeling exercise than anything else, but bear with me. Okay, so we're back to where we were, and I'm just going to grab those and flatten them down. There we go. So we're sort of back to where we were. There we go. Okay, so we've still got the rounded ends on the back, so it's not going to snap off and leave gaps, but at the front it's nice and flat, which is sort of what I wanted. Okay, so what we want to do basically is start off by making sure that all of our objects are zeroed out for this. The reason that I'm doing this is I don't want like any movement or any other rotational positions on this at all. I want everything to be zeroed before I start connecting using the constraints. And normally that's what we would do. Anything that we're constraining, we would try and make sure that we've got sort of everything zeroed out. The model maker should do that for you as a rigger. They should have done that, but it's pretty common that they forget or they overlook. And so basically you either do it yourself or you've got to send the model back. You know, quite often you do it yourself, but you'd send them a message and just say, hey, look, can you double check that you're zeroing everything out before you give me the model? All right, so I'm just going to grab all of those, and what I'm going to do is go to modify freeze transformations. Like that, it's going to get rid of all of that. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of the history. That's going to kind of remove everything from this input list, and that way once we've got the connections, the only thing that will be in here will be the actual constraint connections. So I'll just go edit, delete by type, history. Here we go. So our model is nice and clean. Everything is zeroed out. All the parts are zeroed out, zeros and ones, zeros and ones, zeros and ones, and there is no history on anything. Now, the other thing I'm going to do, because this is going to be slightly more complicated setup than what we've looked at with the other ones, I'm sort of almost producing like a basic rig here for this. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to grab, let's have a quick look here. I'm going to name these, right? So this one is going to be I left, capital L. This one here is going to be I right, capital R. And this one's just going to be head. Okay, now I'm going to take a third locator. I've got two, one for each eye. I want one that's in the middle as well. So I'm just going to duplicate that one and set the translate X to 0. And that's going to center it in the middle, just there. Now the other thing I can do with this is potentially change the color to make it stick out a little bit more. It's quite hard to see when it's this default green. If I pop over to the attribute editor, let's just grab one of these. Let's go to object display, and let's use drawing overrides. Let's go enable overrides, and then we can change the color down here to something different. Now what I'm going to do is go RGB for the color rather than index. What index does is it just gives you sort of like a default basic color palette. A lot of these are used by other sort of things in Maya, like cameras and lights and stuff. And so if you use those, sometimes it's hard to tell if it's just the color, or if it's actually got connections and other weird things going on. So what I like to do is sort of custom colors. So RGB. Then I can click in the little swatch and I can give it sort of like a very unique color. So sort of like a yellowy orange is pretty unique. It doesn't really get used by anything else in Maya, so I might do that. And usually what I do is that for the middle handle, just in here. So if I click on that one, enable overrides, you can see that because I've already changed the overrides on here, the attribute editor is sort of remembering where I am, and it's just allowing me to click another object and it's already sort of in that position. So all I've got to do is turn on overrides, switch to RGB, click on here, and then this remembers the last color. So I'm going to change that one to there. Then I'm going to go back to the first one, and I'm just going to change that to flat out red. Actually, no, I'm going to go green for that one. And then this one over here is going to be red. So RGB and then red. Now the reason for that is usually what you'll do is use red for anything on the right side of the body in a rig. So any right hand controls are going to be red. Any left hand controls will be blue or green. So for instance, I could go with sort of like a blue color like that, a sky blue. And then usually what I'll do is something like a yellow or an orange kind of color for the middle ones. Anything that's like a body control or something that's in the middle. Okay. So as I said, this is going to be almost like a little mini rig that we're building here to show you what the orient constraint does. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is select my locators, and I'm going to zero all the values out. I'm going to freeze them. So we'll go modify, freeze transformations, right? Now the reason that that's important to do is if we move something like this, or we rotate it like this, and even if we randomly scale it like that, right? If I need to get that, and let's say that's an accident, or it ends up being something I don't want. If I select that, all I have to do is type in zeros and then ones for scale, and it will return this back to where it was. So if I grab those numbers and hit 0, and then the scales and hit 1, that locator ends up exactly back where it was. Okay, and it's the same reason that I've done it for these as well. Okay, so let's create our connections. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my left eye. Okay, what I want to do is constrain this to aim here first. I'm going to select this and I'm going to press W on the keyboard. That's our move tool, right? What I'm going to do is pop over to the tool settings. There's a couple of different ways you can do this, and this is sort of like the easy way of doing it, but sometimes it can be a bit wonky. All right, what I'm going to do is hit axis orientation, and I'm going to set that to object, right? So now what's happening is this handle is showing me which direction the object is pointing in, okay? So I can see that the front of the object is this blue handle, which down here is the Z axis, right? That's the forward axis, all right? So then what I'm going to do is grab, so I've got to remember that, right? Z is forward, right? So if I select my locator, now these should be named as well. So this is going to be, I'm going to call this target, L for left. This one, now if I copy that, right? So what I can do is highlight that, hit C, select the next one, just type in that, and I'm just going to call this C for center. So target center, then this one is target right. Oftentimes with I wouldn't actually call that a target because it's not a target. It's not going to be a target. It's actually going to be a control. So I'll just type in CTRL. There we go. So control center. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my target for my left eye. I'm going to then select the left eye as well, and I'm going to pop into the aim constraints. Now this one you can see is quite a little bit more involved. Okay. Now what I want to do is make sure that my aim vector here, first of all, I want to maintain offset, all right? Then what I want to do is I want to make sure that my aim vector, so that's the direction that this is pointing, is set to the Z value just here, because it's pointing along the Z direction, right? So I'm going to change this to 0, and I'm going to change the last one to 1. Now the up vector is the up direction for this object, right? And, you know, based on what we saw earlier on, that's going to be the y-axis, the green one, right? When the move tool switched on. And that's already set. Up vector is already set to that. So that should be fine. Now, world up type, that's set to the vector that we've got set up here, up vector. You could also set it to the object up, which would also be, in our case, the same direction. You could also set it up to the whole world, That's the scene, and so on and so forth, right? What we can do for now is leave that where it is, okay? And then this one, we tell it the world up vector, so the world up direction is y. So this is x, y, z. So the world up vector is pointing up, okay? So then what we can do is double check our constraint axes. We can constrain them all, okay? Now, with this, possibly what we might need to do is only constrain x and z. And the reason for that is if I double check the rotation tool here, and I pop across into the tool settings and change that, make sure that that's object. I want the eyes to be able to go up and down. I want them to be able to go side to side. I don't want them to twist around this way. Now that's actually the Z axis. So what I might do is only constrain up and down, which is the red X axis. So that's that one. And then this side to side one, which is the green axis, which is Y. So what I might do is only constrain X and Y and turn Z off. That way the eyes aren't going to be able to twist sort of this way. Otherwise they look weird. Your eyes don't go sideways when you're looking around. They only go up and down, side to side. Okay, so if those settings are correct, we should be able to hit apply. Okay, and then when I grab this, you can see here that this is highlighting pink. That means it's actually connected to something with the constraint, and I can see that constraint there. So if I grab that, if I grab the grab this handle and I move it, you can see that this is now going to move to point at that handle, and it's also going to go up and down, right? So if I grab this one, I can get it to go anywhere. All right, so now what we're going to do is the exact same settings for the other eye. So I'm going to select the other eye's control target, select the eye, and then just apply that again. So now both of those should look around like that. Now, what's the purpose of this middle one? Well, every time I want to animate the eyes, I don't want to have to keep selecting both of these by, you know, shift selecting them. So what I can do is select these and then shift select the center one, and then I can parent them. So if I go edit, parent, when I select the middle one, let's just close this off. Now when I select this middle handle, I can move both of the other two at the same time, and then the eyes will follow those two targets. So you can see that that's sort of how the orient constraint works. What it does is it makes one object, or you know, multiple objects, point towards another object. Okay. Now the other object could be anything. It could be, you could aim constraint something to a camera so that no matter where you move the camera, the object is always facing the camera, or always facing away from the camera, or always side on, or from, you know, whichever way you've angled it. And that way, anything in the background looks like it's, you know, the camera's sort of rotating around in the background, but, you know, the thing that's oriented to the camera looks like it's static. So you can get kind of like really weird kind of camera moves and things like that. Lots of different things you could do with this. You know, you could automate like an anti-aircraft gun, for instance. Let's say we were doing like a World War II film or something, and we needed an anti-aircraft gun to kind of track, or a radar dish or something to track something that's flying through the sky. All we have to do is orient constraint that sort of rotating thing to the flying object, and basically it will then automatically rotate with it. So we don't have to animate the flying thing and the turret. We can just animate the flying object. The turret will automatically follow it. So that's the orient constraint. So if you've watched this one and all of the other constraint videos, those are all the main constraints sort of for basic constraints. The only other constraint that is sort of, you know, important to look at is the pole vector. And we will be looking at that in a sort of processes further down the track. Pole vectors are used with inverse kinematic systems, which are common for, you know, rigging characters' arms and legs and other things like that. So we will look at those in the future in another video. But for now, within this little series of videos, our little introduction videos, I think we've more or less covered what we need to cover. So with that said, I'm going to leave this video here, and I'll see you next time.